Warhammer Darktide has been out for about 2 months now, and one thing that stood out to me when watching the trailer was this beast of NURGLE. I'm Mark from Morrigans Creations, and I spent £30 on a beast of NURGLE. Everybody knows this model is not amazing. Some of you may like it. Personally, I prefer the Darktide model. So I've decided that I'm going to convert one myself, since Games Workshop doesn't have one readily available. If this is your first time viewing my content, I'm Mark and I like to make models. I do conversions, miniature painting and a little bit of scratch building here and there. So do be sure, if you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe and comment what you'd like to see me do next. Perhaps another Darktide conversion, perhaps something completely different, let me know. So here's just a quick flip through of the booklet in case you haven't got the model yourself. Though in all fairness, I actually followed the instructions a fair bit, until I got to the head, in which I deviated from it a lot. So to start the build, I did the usual steps: snipping, clipping and cleaning up. And I stuck these together using some Tamiya ultra thin cement. I made sure that I applied this to both pieces, gave them a second to cure a little bit, just so that the plastic started to melt before I pressed them together. I also ran a line of this down the middle seam just to make sure it was a bit more robust. Here's the model after doing all that. Notice that I didn't use the belly option that had the mouth. That's because I'm actually going to be using that as part of the head. But to do that first, we're going to have to mix up some Gorilla Put. This is made out of green stuff, which is a 2-part epoxy, and some Milliput, which is basically the same. But mixing them together, you get the best of both worlds, and it's a lot easier to handle. Right, and here I am snipping that other belly option that I'm going to use as part of the head. To do this, I just used my usual Citadel snippers. Don't know whether that was the best idea, don't know if that's going to do anything to them. Hopefully not, because to me that's what they're designed for, going through this kind of plastic. So I filled the main cavity with Gorilla Put and I pressed the new mouth into place. I then used my silicone shapers just to blend that into the rest of the body a little bit better. You can get these shapers in pretty much any hobby store and you can get them relatively cheap. Now we're going to try and bulk out the rest of the head. It doesn't matter if we're a bit too sloppy with this, because this is just going to be our base layer. We're going to be adding a layer of just green stuff over the top, as I feel that takes detail a little better. Next, I used a bit of water on my fingers just to help blend it into the model a little bit better. And we're going to continue bulking this out with more of that Gorilla Put. Another perk of mixing green stuff with Milliput is you save on a lot of money, because green stuff can be expensive. After waiting 24 hours for the putty to cure, I then gave it a light sanding just to help blend it a little bit better. In all fairness, if you're following along at home, you could probably skip this step because you're going to be covering it in green stuff later anyway. Just to help us grip the model a little bit better, we're going to be adding it to this base, which is part of, I believe it was an Ultramarine Outrider, something like that. To help us a little later, we are going to be adding some of these little domes just over the model, just so that we can hint at some of them pustules that are ready to burst. Now that we've mixed up some more green stuff, we're going to be waiting 15 minutes, just so that it makes it a little easier to work with. The part that I decided to sculpt first was the mouth, and that's because I believe this is the main focal point of this model, and it's likely the part that's going to cause me the most trouble. So for me, the sooner we get this part out of the way, the better. When you're working with green stuff, it's always important to keep your tool moist. To to do this, I was using petroleum jelly, which you can get in pretty much any supermarket. This just helps stop the putty from sticking to your tools. The majority of this work is going to be using this tool and this homemade texture roller that I've made probably a few months ago now. This is arguably the easiest way to add texture to your model without having to sit sculpting for hours on end. With a nice little roadmap ahead of me, I then decided to sculpt for hours on end, defining all the little lumps and bumps that you can find in-game. I just want to quickly take the time to thank everybody on the Dark Tide subreddit for helping me with this model whenever I had questions. Everybody likes to see gameplay and stuff on there, so I imagine it would be quite annoying seeing me posting questions all the time. I debated using toothpicks to help make the teeth, but then I realised that I've had this pack of Cos clay in my room for probably about 4 months now, so I felt it was finally time to start using it. I'd grab little bits of the stuff, roll it into a ball and slowly taper it just to the end, ready for baking. The best part about this Cos clay is it stays flexible even after baking, so there's very little chance of me breaking any of these teeth like I have in the past using regular polymer clay. Whilst the green stuff hadn't cured, I managed to easily push these straight into the sculpt, and there's no need for glue because the green stuff is going to hold it there indefinitely. If the teeth were too big, I'd cut them down with a Stanley blade and push them in until they looked right. I used the same domes that I used for the pustules as the eyes. They're about the right size, probably a little bit too big. And yes, I did lose the footage of adding the tentacles. I sourced these from the same kit, cut them out individually and stuck them to the top of the head. Then I primed it with a zenithal prime from above, using black Vallejo primer and a bit of white ink. For a lot of the painting I chose to use my airbrush. I first loaded it up with Castellan Green from Citadel and sprayed this all over the model. As it began to dry, I was slowly adding little bits of Ushabti bone just to put a bit more highlights in. Arguably this step wouldn't be needed as the zenithal prime underneath was still showing through, as I'd thinned my paint quite enough just for it to show through. Next, using the airbrush, I loaded it up with a bit of Mephiston Red. I sprayed this to all the sore parts of the model and also to the inside of the mouth. I did this using the airbrush because I felt that the blends would be a lot better and the layers would be a hell of a lot more smoother. I then decided to give the whole model a dousing in Reichland Flesh shade. This helped to dull down some of the colours and also hide some of those blends that weren't as good. Arguably I should have stopped there, but I like models that are quite vibrant, so I decided to work in some highlights by hand. The colours that I'm choosing to use for these highlights is a mixture of Castellan Green and Auric Flesh, in different mixes just to help blend up more towards that Auric Flesh. I'll admit that it was quite tedious but also satisfying painting all the lumps and bumps all over this model. For the exposed fat layers and the pustules, I layered up some Ushabti bone. Whilst they were drying, I returned to my highlights. Whilst this is running in the background, I'd like to ask that if you are currently enjoying this video, that you please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, as these videos do take a lot of time to record and edit for this channel. So every bit of support that I get really helps out, more than you could imagine. And for the main part, it tells me that the videos that I'm making are actually being watched and enjoyed. People aren't just watching them and clicking off. Which also leads me on to feedback. If you guys have any feedback, good or bad, let me know in the comments, as that also helps me. For returning viewers, thank you for your support, and I just want to let you know that my schedule has changed slightly, so I'm not uploading every other Tuesday. It's now going to be on the 7th and the 21st of every month. After working on all the skin, I then moved on to all the bone parts and the fingernails, which are a bit worn. And to do this, I used Thondia Brown and was highlighting up to an Ushabti bone, whilst adding in a little bit of Pallid Witch flesh just in the highlights. In order to add some definition to the pustules and the fat layers, I added in some Yandan Yellow contrast paint from Citadel. In order to avoid neglecting the tentacles, I broke out the airbrush again and added a thin dilution of Emperor's Children. This was focused more to the top of each tentacle in order to create a smooth gradient. Once I had the airbrush out, I then sprayed some Flash Gets Yellow just to the main pustule weak spot on the back of the model. This was then covered in more Yandan Yellow just to darken up the edges. Now it's time for some technical effects. Here I am mixing some of the Oohoo glue. It's either Oohoo or Yoo-hoo. Sorry, I just had to stop myself from absolutely wetting myself at how I said that. And at first I was using this to make the drooling effects, but I later painted on a layer of NURGLE's rot, just to make it so it looks like he's spitting more of that demonic pestilence. Here I am adding that NURGLE's rot now. I feel that this was a bit more successful than just leaving it as drool. And after a final few touch-ups, the model was finished and this is what we were left with.